Delton Henderson was the assistant dean of Stanford Law School, and we'll get into his role in what led to the hiring of Professor William Gould. So you came to Stanford Law School, Delton, in 1968. And I always started out with a statistic that Harvard Law School graduated its first African American in 1869. When you arrived at Stanford Law School 100 years later, Stanford had never graduated an African American. And it wasn't until the class of 68, 100 years later, that Stanford graduated its first African American. In my class at Stanford, the class of 1970, and I started in 1967, there were no African Americans, there were no Latinos, there were no Native Americans, and there were only 6 women. And because of what you started and what you did, Thelton, is that I know that you were at the law school for 8 years, and when you came, it was about 2% of the student body was minority students. When you left 8 years later, it was more than 20%, an astonishing accomplishment. And now Stanford Law School, the student body is 40% students of color. And I mean, and I personally am so proud of what the Stanford Law School has been able to do, and so proud to be friends with you and to work with you on Thelton, because I think this is incredibly important. Needless to say, when you started at Stanford Law School, there were not only very few minority students, but Stanford Law School had a staunch tradition of hiring as professors only white males. Yep. So, what was it like? You know, and for me, that's just the way things were. I had, in my undergraduate and throughout law school, I'd never had an African-American professor. I never had a female professor. I never had a Latino professor. And now, looking back on it, I'm astonished that I wasn't aware of what little sense that made. So for you, coming to a law school that could be seen as being a bastion of white privilege, what was like coming there? You were both, you were assistant dean, but you were also a faculty member there, and because you did work on stuff. What was it like coming there to an institution that had only white professors, male professors, since its beginning?
Well, you have to understand that I came there. I was on a mission when I came there. I had talked to Dean Manning. I was about my concern that the school hadn't graduated a Black until Sally Ann Payton in 1968. And in response to my concerns, he offered me a half-time job. That's the important part of my start there, to set up such a program. So I was on a mission, and my focus was to set up that program and find qualified minorities from around the country. We talked about a budget, and Davis was good enough to get 2 alumni from the law school to fund the program so that I could travel around the country, interview, recruit. And so I was focused on that. I found some friends on the faculty that I got along with. Mike Wald was an instant friend who is still a friend till today. Tom Gray and Tom Ehrlich. They were all very good friends. Jack Friedenthal, Jerry Gunther were very friendly to the program. And so I spent most of my time associating with them. But other than that, on this half-time basis, I came over to the school and worked as hard as I could, flew around the country looking for minorities. That was my main goal. And I wasn't really concerned about the rest of the schools, quite frankly, at that point.
And just for posterity's sake and to give them their due, why don't we tell us the names of those two alumni who funded the program?
Vic Palmieri and Miles Rubin. Wonderful men, both wonderful men. I got to know them quite well. It's been a wonderful weekend. Vic Palmieri had a wonderful place down south on the beach, and we played tennis. And I thought I was a quite grown-up person, but I was in awe when I finished playing tennis with him and was walking back to his home on the beach there and bump into Cary Grant. It was very good, but two wonderful men, generous men who gave me everything I needed to get the job done.
While you were then identifying, recruiting, and mentoring these students, did you? One of the values, of course, of a diverse faculty is to provide role models.
Right.
And those role models are not only for the minority students, but role models for the white students. Mm-hmm. So did you think about whether that hampered you, that there were no role models at the law school, or that once again, that's something we just didn't focus on?
No, I focused on that. I was very aware of that. And, and that's why Bill was so important when he finally came, because he was a perfect role model. I mean, he was a scholar, a real scholar, the real deal. He was forthcoming, he was available, and he was available to the minority students that by then there were half dozen or so, more than that, minority students at the school by the time Bill got there in 1972. And Bill was open to those. I used to give affairs for the minority students. Bill would come to those, and it was very important to the students. No question about it. And important to me to also have a fellow minority there at the law school.
And so so prior to Bill's coming, you were conscious about the fact that one of the things that hampered the program was the lack of a diverse faculty that would provide role models for the students.
Absolutely. Bill is a real sportsman of baseball and all, and we used to use baseball analogies. And I used a sports analogy. I played football at Cal, and I know when you're recruiting athletes, it's very important when they come there to see another Black athlete. It really helps, and I knew that. And so I would get some of the Black undergraduate students to help me. There were no Black or minority students at the law school, but there were a few at the undergraduate school. And I would get them to help. And there were people like Charles Ogletree at the undergraduate school and many others that helped. That's important in recruiting. So that was the drawback.
But in fact, there were a few minority students, and Leroy Bobbitt and Luis Nogales, right, worked closely, who were law school students.
Yeah, they were close. In fact, I had them. I was sending them out to do recruiting for me. Yes, and then they would be there to greet the students when they came, and they both did a wonderful job.
Now it's kind of an interesting story that when Bill was hired, is that you first found out that he was hired after he was already there, and you weren't involved at all in.
Not at all.
And so tell us about that.
Well, it just, as I said, he showed up. I can't remember who I heard it from, that we had this Black faculty person coming, and I was elated by it. I was so glad to meet Bill, and we bonded immediately. We bonded on every level at the school, the only Blacks at the school in any administrative or faculty position. We love sports together. He's a huge jazz fan. We love jazz, and his wife's a great cook. They would invite me over. It was just a love at first sight, and it really has lasted for 50 years.
And so to the extent that you were always concerned that they were not role models, is that the coming of Bill alleviated, obviously, that concern. And I presume you saw that as being a huge step at the law school in making your job easier and more productive.
Oh yeah, no question about it. No question about it.
Uh, so we've talked about this before, but were you curious about the fact that you were one of the last to know about Bill being that Professor Gould
You
being hired?
Interestingly enough, I wasn't. Because I just thought, well, I guess this is the way law schools work. You know, I didn't think anything strange about it. Uh, I thought that's the way it's done.
And once again, although your position was assistant dean, for all practical purposes, you were the first Black professor at Stanford Law School.
Right.
And did you feel additional pressure on you in terms of your teaching because you were in that position?
Yeah. Well, I felt real pressure because I, I'm not naturally a teacher. I tell great stories. I'm a storyteller, but I don't have a professorial mind. But I was out there trying to do my best. And indeed, at some point, I really felt that part of what they were doing, I was teaching a course, a civil pro course with Jack Friedenthal. I was teaching a criminal course with John Kaplan. Uh, I taught a course with Tony Amsterdam. Uh, and it became regular each year that I was teaching something, co-teaching. And I came to conclude, I'll never know if it's true, but I concluded that they were testing me, that they were taking a look at me and trying to get me to a professorship or a faculty, full faculty position, sort of through the back door. That was my feeling. No one ever told me that, but I believe that's what was going on.
I know that prior to your coming, there have been an attempt to bring an African American student into the student body at Stanford Law School, and the planning was not done well, and it turned out to not very. It didn't turn out well at all.
Yeah, it
And
didn't.
yeah, did you feel the pressure knowing that if you failed, is that it would really adversely affect the law school and minority students, uh, and that there was this presumably this burden on you to make sure you got it right?
I did. I felt enormous pressure, uh, and I probably put a lot of pressure on myself because I very naively thought, okay, I had never thought about teaching or law school administrative work. I was a lawyer. I was a civil rights lawyer, as I thought of myself. And at the time, I went over a legal aid lawyer. And my plan was to come to Stanford for 3 years and set up the program, get it going, and then go back, either back to legal aid or back to private practice. That was my plan, but I was a very naive young man in those days. And once I saw how institutions work, how the law school worked, and some of the faculty there that were rather resistant to the rapidly rising minority membership at the law school, minority enrollment, I realized that all the commitments that Bailiff Manning made were to me, and that if I left after 3 years, it would stop right there, or at least would slow down tremendously. And I ended up, as you said in your introduction, for 8 years to institutionalize the program. It was important enough to me to this became permanent. Stanford didn't abandon this as soon as I left. And so I didn't leave until it was a part of the university. And it would have been very embarrassing for them to undermine it or abandon it at that point.
And everybody unanimously has said that what you did in smoothing the way and having the program work so smoothly and successfully that it paved the way for the diversification of the law school faculty as well. Had things not gone well, there probably would have been much more difficult to institute that diversification. So, looking back on it, how do you see your role in not only diversifying the student body, but diversifying the Stanford community and specifically leading to the diversification of the faculty?
Well, I felt it was very important to be a role model. My biggest hero uh, has always been Jackie Robinson. I was a big baseball fan. I played baseball through from little league all the way through college baseball, and I know that if Jackie Robinson had not acted the way they hoped he would act and lead the way and open that door, there wouldn't have been the major league progress that he followed his success. And I use that as my own model that I had this opening the door at Stanford, and I had to do it right so that they would, those that were less friendly would see no harm. This isn't so bad at all. And I worked very hard to be the Jackie Robinson at Stanford that would open the door and bring in students, bring in qualified students. It's very important that it worked, not just bring in some people who would flunk out and go on their way. And so, yeah, I was very conscious of that. I wanted it to work long term.
So then, Bill Kate, you realized at that point that this was very significant in so many ways for the law school.
Right.
And I presume that you immediately began planning about how to involve yourselves with each other and
Yeah.
involve and still talk about that.
Well, well, as soon as I took the job, or as soon as I agreed to take it, I realized, as I started getting into it more and more, that one of the problems I was going to have is that there were not very many undergraduate minority students coming through the pipeline to recruit for law school. That was a real problem. And so I started focusing on that. How am I going to find where are these students going to come from? Because the one thing I didn't want to do was bring students in simply because they were minority who were in over their head and they weren't going to succeed. Where am I going to find these people? And one of the things that was helpful to me was I used myself as a model. When I was very lucky when I got a football scholarship to Cal, and Cal admitted me out of a all black school in Los Angeles that didn't have a good academic recommendation. And they admitted me on the condition that I go to summer school and take 2 courses and pass them both. And that really saved me. I don't think I would have made it at Cal because the first exam I had in summer was History 4A course and give the significance of Napoleon's blockade of the English coast. And I had never in my life had anything other than a true, false, and a multiple choice question. I didn't know how to write an essay question.
You didn't even it didn't even know what an essay question was.
Know what an essay question was. So I started writing. I had studied my rear off. So I really read everything there. And I was used to memorizing it and throwing it back at somebody. So I sort of did that on the exam and I got a D on the exam, but with this wonderful professor said, "Mr. Henderson, come see me." Uh, and he took an interest in me. And he said, "I know you studied because I wrote the book. We're using my textbook." And you threw everything back at me. You know, Napoleon was short. He was married to Josephine. You gave me all the facts in the book, but you didn't tell me the significance of his blockade. And he found out that I was up there to play football. And I said, "Well, will they pay for a tutor for you?" And I said, "I don't know." And I went to the athletic department and they said, "Of course they would." And he had his teaching fellow tutor me, and the scales started falling off. Oh, first thing he did was show me 3A papers. And I said, "Oh, that's, well, I can do that." And, you know, and it got, and I passed both courses in the summer. But had I just started in the fall without that prep, I would have probably gotten all F's in all 5 courses and flunked out. So I had that in mind in terms of what I was trying to do and what I was looking for, and that there might be people like me that were smart enough, but didn't have the preparation. And so I arranged for one of the students at Stanford that was a good student to be a tutor, to tutor. And I was ready to tutor and talk to them and see that they were ready to go and that they had the tools to do it. That was what I was trying to do.
And so, to the extent that your pitch, as it were, to students that you were attempting to recruit to Stanford Law School, that you could say to them, previous to Professor Gould's coming, that, you know, I think as you phrased it before, is that, come on in, the water is fine. There's other Black students here and things are going well. But I guess as that sales presentation, as it were, was even more effective when you could say that one of the professors at Stanford Law School was an African American.
Absolutely. No question about it. And especially one like Bill that was so open and available to them. It wasn't like, "Okay, yeah, bring them in and I'll say hi to them, tell them, but I'm busy." It wasn't like that. Bill was open, available, and that was a big thing to these students. No question about it.
So do you remember anything in particular about his reaching out to students, to anything special that you can recall illustrating what you're talking about?
Well, he was available. I think probably you have on your list a student that I particularly remember and like, and I've known him all of these years too. I've just been so impressed how Bill took Gary Williams under his arm. What do you take someone under their mentor,
Yeah.
and really groomed him. And Gary's a beloved and distinguished faculty member at Loyola Law School, and he will tell you uh, in an instant that he owes it all to Bill, because Bill took him when he was, I think Gary was working with the ACLU or something, and wasn't particularly happy with that. And Bill got him this interview at Loyola, and that's what he did with students. He didn't just pat them on the shoulder and say, "Go get them." He went with them. He saw that they got there, and the students understood that and appreciated it. And again, when he would spend time at the law school minority, I would give a party each at the start of each semester, and at a Black lawyer, Harry Bremon was his name, first Black partner at Wilson Sons. Anyway, Bill would go to these parties and really spend time, and be sitting around the barbecue pit and talking to these students, encouraging them, sharing stories with them, making sure they felt free to come by his office and that they had a friend there. It's very important. Very important.
Especially with Gary Williams, because not only did Professor Gould set up the interview, it was Professor Gould's idea that Gary Williams ought to go into teaching.
Yeah, Yeah.
I mean, Gary had never thought about it
I,
and was discussing what he was going to do. And Professor Gould said, I think you'd be a good law school professor.
yeah.
And not only that, I think I can get you that job.
Right. And did it. And it's,
And,
yeah. And
not only did he do this with black students, he did this with white students.
absolutely,
And
absolutely.
so Keith Cunningham was a student who was a practitioner in labor law and wanted to teach labor law in law school, and Bill was aware of that. And so when Professor Gould became a visiting professor at Willamette Law School up in Portland, he reached out to Keith Cunningham and said, "Why don't you help me teach this class?"
Yeah.
And Keith Cunningham, just essentially out of the blue, reached out to him. And 16 years later, Keith Cunningham is still a labor law professor at Willamette Law School.
Oh,
And it's because Bill had the knowledge of Keith Cunningham, what he wanted to do, what his talents were, and when he saw an opportunity, he immediately acted on it.
yeah.
It's or the story of Ken Shropshire, who is the head of sports law now at Wharton, is that Professor Gould reached out, and a really interesting story, and created Ken Shropshire's career.
Yeah.
You
And
know,
yeah, Bill was one of the guys that, spearheaded the idea of sports law, and he was one of the early people that just created the field of sports law. Amazing man. It really quite extraordinary.
if you can think about then Bill's impact on the law school. I mean, not only, of course, as diversifying the law school faculty, which was, this place that had only white professors, old white professors, in its history, and being the first African American and being so successful. So, do you have any more thoughts about that? His impact on the law school, his impact on attracting minority students, and just who he is.
Yeah, impacting, attracting minority students, but in attracting further minority faculty members. Yeah, I think he had a tremendous impact. And again, I use the Jackie Robinson analogy. Someone like Bill that comes in and is the real deal. He's a scholar. No one questions it. His scholarship is impeccable. It's voluminous. He's prolific in his productivity. Uh, it opens a door at Stanford for whether, and I'm not accusing them of anything, but very often when you say you do your first and you're way behind other schools and doing, you say, okay, well, let's find somebody, and you're making a gesture. And if the person isn't that very good, the door closes again. But Bill was so good, such an outstanding faculty person in every way that you said, oh, we didn't know that there was people like that out there. He opened the door. He served as a model. He showed that it can be done, and that everybody learned from him. The rest of the faculty at the school, the students saw what they were capable of doing through Bill, and it just made all the difference in the world. I think the willingness of Stanford to increase to, I don't know what their faculty or their minority faculty numbers are now, but I'm sure that whatever number that is in part due to Bill opening that door so wide and so effectively.
knowing now that it was a dozen years before the next African American was hired. And of course, the faculty now, and I don't know the exact numbers, but it is very, very diverse. They've just the first, it's taken all these years, but the first African American female professor was granted tenure.
Mm-hmm.
Just this year at Stanford Law School. The law school has hired its first Native American female professor at the law school. It's a very, very different place. And you know that you were key in changing the law school. Had you failed in what you were doing, had it not gone so smoothly and successfully, we wouldn't be where we are now. It would have been someplace, but not as good. But there is a real emphasis on diversity at the law school, both in the student body and in the faculty, which as a Stanford Law grad, I'm very, very proud about, and proud to know you and be able to document your role in all of this.
Thank you so much. You're doing a wonderful job with this, and I just look forward to seeing this and all the other things you're now doing with other people all in one package. It's phenomenal, and I don't know where you learned to do that. You didn't learn to do all of that at Stanford Law School, I'm sure, but wherever you learned it, you've done a phenomenal job. You've inspired people, you've energized us all, and it's great. It's great for Stanford.
Hello, I am Regina Petty. I'm a partner and chief diversity officer at Fisher Phillips.
What I understand is that you told me that although you disappointed Bill by becoming a management lawyer, is that you told me that people on the labor side, you believe it is better for them that they work with somebody with your background who understands labor issues from the labor side as well.
I did come to believe that in practice. I actually initially stayed away at the first general practice firm I joined in San Diego that had the largest labor and employment practice in San Diego at the time, and were trying to recruit me away from the litigation practice to join their practice, because that was in the early 80s, and I was concerned that employers weren't ready to actually comply with the discrimination laws and might be only looking for lawyers who were trying to help them avoid compliance. And I knew that wasn't a good fit for me, especially as a young lawyer. So I went with the litigation practice, general litigation practice, even though at Stanford, I took every course that Professor Gould offered, and along with Professor Gunther's con law class and Professor Babcock's crim law class, they were my favorites.
And so that's when you first met Bill, when you were his student at Stanford Law School, or when you got there, did you establish a connection with him?
When I got there first year of law school, I did not start taking his classes until the second year. I grew up in Los Angeles. I was actually born in Watts and raised in Compton, Gardena, and Inglewood. And Los Angeles was very segregated when I was growing up in the 1960s and 70s, which often comes as a surprise to people who are not from Southern California. So I actually grew up in a Black community residentially until we moved to Inglewood. And at the time that we moved to Inglewood, because of the increasing numbers of Black families that were purchasing homes in Inglewood, white flight had begun from Inglewood. So when I first started junior high school in Inglewood, it was an integrated community, by the time I graduated from high school, it was barely integrated at all.
And so by the time you got to Stanford undergrad, you had been around white people enough so that you were comfortable being around white people. Is that correct?
I really didn't give it a second thought one way or the other. So
Yeah.
my mother was an elementary school teacher, and all of her closest friends were also African-American elementary school teachers and principals. But because they were the first to integrate the faculties at LA Unified School District, I was exposed to a lot of white teachers as a child that were also my mother's coworkers. And so I didn't really think very much about being comfortable around white people or not until 1968, I would say, when I was about 11 years old and I was trying to understand the rioting that was happening around the country and the racial divide.
And so, but as you're growing up, then in your communities, there were Black people of power that you had dealt with.
Well, that actually is the sort of hidden silver lining of segregation. Is I grew up in a community where Black people were in charge of everything. I grew up in a Black church, run by Black deacons and a Black pastor. My mother was the president of various auxiliaries in the church and ran the church's vacation Bible school, and ultimately became the national president of a Black church auxiliary. On top of that, my mother's college friend and sorority sister at Texas Southern University in Houston was Barbara Jordan. And they continued to keep in touch after my mother moved to California. And so I met her a number of times, and I was therefore exposed to Black women and Black men who being attorneys. So that idea even was not a foreign concept to me. And then as the civil rights movement, grew and became such a source of violence and opposition, I started paying a lot of attention to what was happening in the courts and following the extremely important role that Black lawyers like Thurgood Marshall were playing in changing the law. And that is what cemented my interest in becoming an attorney. But I couldn't help but notice, of course, because of the segregation of the judiciary at that point in time, that it was the rulings of white judges in those cases that ultimately produced the change in the law.
And as you were growing up, and as you were junior high or high school, and we were thinking about being a lawyer, was it very common? Did you have friends Black friends who were thinking about being lawyers, or was this kind of uncommon among the people that were classmates?
It was still unusual for my age group to know Black lawyers. The fact that I knew a handful was pretty unusual, and that didn't really change. If you look at the data from the ABA until the early 1990s, that statistically the number of Black lawyers increased to the point where maybe it would be pretty commonplace for someone to know at least one Black lawyer. We were a rare breed when I came out of law school in 1982, weren't we, Kenny?
And what did you know about Stanford when you went there? Did you expect that it was going to be diversified? Did you expect that you were going to be in a situation where most of the classmates were going to be white, or it's something that really didn't make that much difference to you?
Oh, it did make a difference to me, actually, in my ultimate decision to choose Stanford. So the only reason I applied to Stanford was I had an opportunity to go to a Stanford USC game at USC and see the Stanford band for the first time, actually the fall of my senior year of high school. And I told my mom after that, I want to go to this school called Stanford because they have a lot of fun there. The band is great. That's actually why I applied to Stanford. It was not on my application list. After I was accepted, my first choice continued to be a school back east, which deeply troubled my mother. She did not want me to leave California, and she started a full court press to get me to decide to go to Stanford. That included contacting the admissions office, asking if there were any Black staff in the admissions office, finding the one Black staff person at the time and telling him, I need you to help my daughter choose Stanford. Help me convince my daughter to choose Stanford. And she brought me to the campus, and he had arranged a great day for me to visit that day that included the Black theme house, Ujamaa. And that was such a wonderful experience, seeing the camaraderie and support centered around the Black theme house at Stanford amongst the Black students. They made me feel that if you're worried about coming here, don't be. We don't let anybody fail. We will be here for you. We are a community. And fortunately, my freshman year dorm assignment was in that dorm. So I was living in two worlds. I had a Black community cocoon similar to what I had grown up with, through my childhood, including into my teen years, within the predominantly white environment at Stanford. And I had this whole community advising me about everything that you could possibly want advice about as a freshman and sophomore to be successful at Stanford as an undergrad.
And so as you were there, you started to figure out pretty quickly, this was a good decision.
Best decision I could have made. I never regretted going to Stanford.
It's so funny. It's Regina and I, we've known each other all these years. We've never sat down and talked about where we grew up specifically, but I think just a couple miles away, the same story. And a couple years earlier. I mean, so born in the Crenshaw district when it was a predominantly Black in the part of town that we were in, Crenshaw and Adams, for those who know the streets. And then as my father had success, he wanted to move to a bigger house, which ended up being what's Baldwin Hills now, which was predominantly white at the time. It was early 60s. And I look at my elementary school pictures, and my brother and I are the Black kids there for about 2 years. And then all of a sudden, all the pictures are predominantly Black. I mean, white flight was real. And that was, our first exposure to this kind of phenomenon. How does this kind of thing happen? At both schools, elementary school wise, we had a good number of Black teachers. So having Black teachers was not that unusual. I mean, white teachers too, even when the schools became predominantly Black again. So when I got to Stanford, it was a definite reduction in the number of Black faculty, but there was still, my first advisor as an undergrad was a Black faculty member, took a number of classes from Black faculty. It was when I got to law school, that was the first place. And it's, my first stop was at Columbia for 2 years. And there was one Black faculty member, Kellis Parker. And then when I came to Stanford the third year, there's one Black faculty member. And as you looked around in our era, that was pretty much the case. Derek Bell at Harvard, or Ralph Smith at Penn, or there was typically one. And we were fortunate that Bill was our one, and he was so successful in that kind of way. So it wasn't all the stuff that you kind of think people might have problems with in terms of this transition into the white world. Stanford, especially at the undergrad level, was uniquely set up to help you make that journey. Although, we had great consciousness of where we were. And Regina mentioned the theme houses. When I first got there, it was in Robley, which was a little bit different, but the same idea. And I remember the first few weeks kind of leaving the dorm, going off into the white campus and being anxious to get back to the dorm for some sense of what had been my normalcy. And I think Bill kind of provided some of that in law school too, that you knew you could go in his office and you could have a full conversation and not have to restrain, other than, old professor versus, not kind of restrain the kind of things that you talked about. So he had that level of comfort at the law school, although, it was stark though, that even at the time, Ladoris was there, but in terms of faculty, that, Bill was in.
So what year did you arrive at Stanford Law School?
Law school 79, 80.
So by that time, Felton has left, is that right?
Right.
Yeah. So going back, how old were you and how did you decide to become a lawyer? Did you know other lawyers? Was it unusual for somebody growing up in your neighborhood who was Black who decided to become a lawyer?
I was trying to think, I remember a lot of us as kids saying we were going to be lawyers. But when I look back in the neighborhood, kids that actually did become lawyers, there weren't that many. There were, part of your question is, were there lawyer role models in the community? For sure. Just as Regina said, there was, some of my father's buddies and there were certainly, opportunities to meet lawyers if you were doing something wrong. You may have encountered a Black lawyer along the way. So yeah, there was a presence and there was an awareness, but it was still, even going to college was not necessarily universal. It was coming out of my high school, the idea of going to community college was pretty dominant, that there was this transition movement, and the idea of being fortunate enough to get a scholarship to go to Stanford was kind of crazy. Although from our school, we had a couple of other Black people that had come before me. So that was my level of awareness about the place, just knowing that it existed. And then I was fortunate enough to get a football scholarship. So that's really what set the path for me. But just like Regina too, whatever trepidation I had, once I went on the visit, the band didn't do anything for me. But but the idea of meeting other guys who would be my teammates who lived in the Black dorm, and that level of comfort, and they relate just as Regina said. I said, I had kind of this remote idea, well, if football doesn't work out, maybe I'll go to law school. Mm-hmm. And so one of the recommendations was, by one of these guys was, well, major in political science. And I was like, well, what if I don't get in law school? Can I still get a job with a political science degree? Shouldn't I major in business or something that's, kind of straight to job? And these, I remember these guys laughing at me saying, man, you don't need to worry about that. You'll get through and you'll get in somewhere. Just, we will make sure that happens.
And then you made a decision to go to Columbia for law school. Was that a rejection of Stanford on some level, or why did you decide to do that?
What? So it's interesting. I think about when the number of and it was always the case that there was a couple of guys from the football team that went to Lost Jackie Brown, and kind of guys from that era. I didn't apply to Stanford Law School coming out. I was ready to get out of there. But it wasn't a rejection. I mean, I think it was in a lot of ways, and one of the reasons why I came back. I mean, I didn't really appreciate the place as much as I should have in the moment, which I think is the case with a lot of things we do in life. I mean, the idea that it was this kind of there were no tragic events, that everything kind of went smooth, and I made these great friends. I think in my mind that was the college experience. That was what everybody got to enjoy that, because you didn't ever have a chance to compare with people how they were doing elsewhere in depth until kind of after the fact that I realized what it was. So for me, and I'd never lived on the East Coast, it was a new opportunity. So all that kind of stuff is what got me out of there.
So does it resonate with you when Regina said she lived in two worlds when she was at Stanford as an undergrad, both in terms of the dorm that she was in, but also that she was dealing with a lot of other people?
So you're asking a great sociological question in a broader sense. I mean, I think this is the old Du Bois kind of commentary. I mean, we always live in two worlds. I mean, the worst thing to do is to try to defeat that, not live in two worlds. And it's probably more than two, that you have the consciousness. You continue to be yourself, but how these other worlds accept you or how you're impacted by them in the moment causes you to react in different kinds of ways. I mean, this is very much the issue of going to the Black dorm or going in Bill's office versus going into Kaplan's office or going into Branner Hall or something. It's just different location. Now the maturity that I would say, even while we were at Stanford, we were able to develop it's in some sense, I mean, like I say, it's not our problem. It's our ability to deal with it. But the different reactions to us happen in different places. Columbia, I think there were, I don't know, 30 Black people in each class. They were much larger classes than at Stanford. So there was a great level of comfort on that issue. I mean, a lot of it for me, now that I've lived in Philadelphia for 40 years, sounds kind of funny to say this, was this East Coast thing. I was like, what am I doing? What am I doing here? And so, I had an opportunity to apply as a non-matriculating student, spend a year at Stanford. So let me see what that's about. And this was I mentioned Ladoris earlier. I mean, Ladoris was just doing a tremendous job of inspiring.
And that's Ladoris
Cordell, inspiring Black students at Stanford to apply in a way that we had not done. And then she was receptive to these kinds of, very few people did it, kind of transfer opportunities. So coming back to me, I mean, I had all these thoughts about, how wonderful it had been, 2 years later, I said, that was a pretty good place after all. And also, it's interesting too. I mean, I knew about the work that Bill was doing, and he'd done a little bit of sports related stuff, which I had some interest in. So I spoke with him a bit as I think about it. So he was certainly played a little bit of a role in that. But it was striking then. I mean, if you're talking about Leroy Bobbitt, Sally Ann Payton, and Vaughn. There weren't that many more in each class while Regina and I were there. I mean, it was much better. And by the way, this sidebar. So one of the reasons my earliest mentions of Stanford Law School to me was my high school geometry teacher was Sally Ann Payton's mother. So she would always tell me, my daughter's, I guess by the time I was in whatever class she was teaching, I think Sally Ann was in Michigan or somewhere at that time. But but it's a place that was always attractive to me, and but for this idea of I need to try something different, I need to get out of here. I probably would have given it more thought coming out.
And I want to welcome Judge Tony Richardson, who is on us here. So we're just asking these questions, and we're going to get to you shortly, Tony. But let me ask this. at Stanford, Ladouris, especially after Thelton left, you know Thelton, and have you met Thelton?
Yeah, I mean, think about it, he was kind of this very senior guy. Certainly got, had interactions with him.
Yeah.
When I first got to Stanford, he was there. I mean, I got to Stanford in '73, so he was still around.
In terms of race, was there a difference between what it was like at Columbia and what it was like at Stanford?
I feel like I need to lay down on my couch to answer that question.
You could just ignore these. You can ignore these questions too if you want.
That's a very deep question. It's very different. I don't know, good, bad, or what, but a very different kind of setting. I mean, we were all in the same time, living in the same time, and same kinds of issues. But I will say, I mean, Columbia is in Manhattan, Harlem, in or adjacent, however you want to characterize it. So you were struck by the realities of the world pretty quickly. There was a East Coast, the Black American Law Students Association, BALSA, was way more invigorated because there's so many schools around. There was a lot of this kind of activity for Black students. When I first got to Columbia, we're dealing with Bakke, and so all these issues were there. So it was a different moment in time. And you come back to Stanford, to the country club, we certainly had issues. They weren't, you had to drive to East Palo Alto to get stuff really in your face. Otherwise, you could just be a part of the country club atmosphere more so. But and that's not to say, I mean, I always felt like we were extraordinarily politically active, engaged, involved at Stanford, but it was harder to be directly engaged as opposed to let's get on the train and go down to the Supreme Court and protest or just go up to Harlem. It was so much easier and so much in your face, I guess is the best way to say it, at Columbia.
When you came back from Columbia, was part of the equation the fact that Bill was at Stanford Law School, that there was a Black professor there, or it really wasn't that significant in your decision?
Wasn't that significant, but I know I knew it. I mean, if there were no Black professors, maybe because I did, as Regina said, whatever course he taught. I probably in the year I was there, I took, I know I did the research, independent study. I took some advanced labor course. I'd taken a good amount of labor law at Columbia, so I was glad he was there. And the educational atmosphere, I guess is a good way to phrase it, was, and again, I can never figure out, was it the third year or was the place really that much different? Such a different, and I took courses like evidence. I took I took a course from Barbara Babcock. I took some of the bigger kind of traditional courses. So so it wasn't all seminars, and they were very different in terms of the atmosphere. And again, it might have been part of it was a third year, so I said, let me just get through this. But I think there really was less of a traditional Kingsfield intimidation kind of structure that was in place.
And
let me add another
Please.
faculty member of color that, at least for my class, I'm in the class of '82, so we came on the law school campus in 1979. But Professor Miguel Mendez was very important to the fabric of the law school experience for all students of color as well. So we didn't see ourselves as just having one professor of color, because we had both Professor Gould and Professor Mendez.
And as a matter, go ahead.
I agree, absolutely. In fact, I just jotted down Professor Mendez's name to make sure I mentioned him as well, gave him that shout out, because I think in many ways he was as significant a contributor to the goodwill and the good feelings we had as minority students at Stanford as Professor Gould was. And he was supportive of not just the Latino students, but the Black students as well. And very, very encouraging and very positive. And as you know, he passed away several years ago, and it was one of the most, I remember when I saw him last at Stanford with Professor Gould. I think it was him celebrating a birthday or something. Oh, it was Professor Gould celebrating a birthday. It was at his home. Professor Mendez was there, and he was sick at the time, but he was doing better, and he still had that same incredible vibe. And I assume you know this, Alan, Professor Gould and Professor Mendez were incredibly close. They were best of friends. Ken, nice to meet you. And Regina, I know of you, and it's nice to see you.
Nice
Your
to see you,
reputation preceded you. I got there in 80, after you had graduated, because I transferred. Guess from where? Columbia.
Oh, is that right?
So Ken, when you were talking about Columbia experience and going to Stanford, I'm sitting there saying, "Oh my gosh, that's my experience. I did that." So I could answer. I could answer some of those questions as well.
What year did you graduate from Stanford then? Law school?
84, but I didn't
Okay.
arrive until 82, and Regina had graduated, as I recall, in 82, and she was in that incredible class that everyone spoke of with such reverence and such. And, I missed it. But that's when I arrived in the fall of 82. I spent my first year at Columbia. I don't want to bore any of you guys with the reasons why I ended up there, but the short story is I wanted to go to Stanford. I got accepted to Stanford. I met LaDoris Cordell, loved everything about it, loved her. Loved Shirley, whose last name escapes me, her secretary.
Yes.
Who was a white woman, older, who was like a mother to the Black students. She was incredible. So everything about Stanford was just amazing to me. And when I told them I wasn't coming, it ripped my heart out. But it was because at the time, the girlfriend, the woman who became my wife, with whom I went to college, was going to be in New York City working at Doubleday, and I was very insecure, and I felt that if this poor law student was stuck on the West Coast, here she is on the East Coast, all those guys were going to be all over her. That was going to be done deal. I got into Columbia and reasoned that as much as my girlfriend at the time, my wife-to-be, as much as we wanted to be on the West Coast, coming from Columbia, I ought to be able, it shouldn't be bad, it shouldn't be a problem to get to the West Coast, because Columbia was a great law school with a great reputation and so forth. So I went to Columbia fully intending to spend 3 years there. Lo and behold, my girlfriend, wife, was a biomechanical engineer, decided that that's not what she wanted to do, fell in love with the experience I had during my first year, and decided she was going to go to law school, applied to all the schools, got in, including Stanford. And then when Stanford was really heavily recruiting her, LaDoris, she essentially said to Stanford, Tony and I come as a pair. We come as a team. I'm only coming if he comes. And so, and Ken, I think you pointed out this, the size of the classes were different. Columbia was twice as large, 300 students per class, as Stanford, which was about 150, 160. So there wasn't an immediate fix. Going from a larger school to a smaller school, the numbers just weren't there. But that was a push that my wife made. And eventually it worked out. A slot opened up and Stanford said, oh, okay, you can come too, Tony. That's how I ended up at Stanford. Now, I didn't have an appreciation, though, at that time about Professor Gould, about Professor Mendez. I loved the vibe at the school. That was not my focus at all, to be honest. It wasn't until I was actually there as a student that I saw the magnificence of Professor Gould and Professor Mendez, and I took their courses and that sort of thing. And of course, I knew about LaDoris, who herself is just an amazing, amazing, amazing person. Mm-hmm. And Shirley, her secretary at the time, that was an allure for me. And it proved to be fortuitous and it worked out great. I was interested in the course because I was always focused. I grew up very poor and in the Deep South. Labor issues were always at the forefront of my mind. I always associated with the employee, not the employer, that sort of thing. I became interested in taking that course for that reason. After I took the course, I decided I didn't want to do labor law. I will say that. No, and that had nothing to do with Professor Gould. But when I took the course, I gained an appreciation for who Professor Gould was. It was only then, to be honest. And then I grew fond of him after I had taken his course in my third year, when I was not one of his students. That's when we became close. I was a baseball player, and as you all know, I mean, he's an incredible fanatic, especially for a team that I deplore to this day, the Boston Red Sox. I kept saying to him, how could you root for that team? Don't you know their history? So we used to have those kind of discussions. And then we would go out in the afternoon. He was more into it than I was, to shag flies, to throw the ball and such. And we would do that from time to time. So I got to know him, not then as a professor, but as, and it was strange because I had such reverence for him. I looked up to him, but here he was someone who I played ball with, and we became friends.
And I
that
understand.
that could not have happened at Columbia, by the way. You know, you asked about the difference. That did not. There was a line at Columbia that was so drawn, professors, students, and you know, you made an appointment to see a professor at Columbia. The doors are always closed. You have to knock. You have to have an appointment. Didn't happen at Stanford. You can walk in. The doors were literally open, not just to Professor Gould, but to other professors, white professors. It was such a different feel. We were treated more as adults, I felt, at Stanford Law School than we were treated as young students at Columbia. It's a totally different experience.
Yeah, so one funny Columbia thing. There was even and I don't know, Tony, if you were there long enough to experience, there was even a separate elevator. At least you had to have an elevator key for faculty to use because it was schools in this building up and down.
Yeah.
Kind of very anti-Stanford kind of structure as well. But wonderful place, but just very different.
And I understand, Tony, that you became a member of Bill's family. Essentially, I understand you became close friends with Bill V.
When Professor Gould realized I was going to go down to clerk for Judge Williams, who I will say is the first Black federal district court judge appointed west of the Mississippi.
And the father of Vaughn Williams, who we were just talking about.
Well, that's true.
Well, yeah. But
when he found out I was coming down to LA to clerk, he said, I got to put you in touch with my son. He's living down there. I think Bill had just finished up at Occidental. So I didn't know the younger Bill at all, but his dad put me in touch with him. And as soon as I landed, I got a hold of Bill, and now Bill is my best friend, became my best friend. So that's the connection. Bill, to your point, Alan, got married after I did. Yes. And had two children, and his oldest daughter, he asked me to be the godfather. So I'm the godfather of his oldest daughter, right? I have a deep connection with the Gould family.
I was wondering if Ken recalls that I slept on his couch while he was at Columbia one day because I made a trip back east to visit to go to a student conference and at the same time visit law schools that I was applying to. So I feel like I have this teeny little bit of Columbia connection. But I was very glad that Judge Richardson mentioned Professor Babcock again, because when she joined the faculty, as you know, I think maybe she was the first or second female faculty member.
She was the first.
Okay, and again, like the first professors of color, she involved herself with the students and was a part of what made for women of color, their experience richer as students at the law school too. So whenever I think back on my experience at Stanford, all of those professors are a part of it. And of course, Ladoris and Shirley were socially central once they got us onto the campus in the kind of experience and support that we had as well. And so it is difficult, in my memory, to just single out one person who was either the reason I went to Stanford or made the difference in the quality of the experience that I had. I can single out a couple of people who contributed to the negative experiences that I had at the law school, which were more than the negative experiences that I had in undergrad. But Stanford, all of those people made Stanford into a welcoming community for diverse students. I think a little bit before the core faculty was even ready for it. Our class, the class of '82, thanks, to Judge Thelton sowing the seeds, and then Judge Cordell's extremely energetic approach to recruiting diverse students to Stanford. The class of '82 had the highest number ever of Black and Latino law students in that a class had at Stanford. I apologize that I have not followed the data since then, so I'm sure that classes since us have topped us, but it was a huge standout because I think before that class, the highest number of Black students in the same class was around 7, Latino students around 5. Our class had 14 African Americans, 13 Latino students, and back then did very poorly with Asian students, which I know has been probably the most dramatic change for diversity at Stanford. So, reaching about nearly 30 ethnically diverse students in one class was a major milestone that was very exciting to all of us. But there was a blemish. Our first day of law school, the law school newsletter came out for the start of that semester, and there was an interview with a Stanford faculty member who strenuously objected to the fact that there were so many diverse students who were coming to Stanford now. And as a part of articulating his objections, he greeted us with the statement that we were going to form an identifiable bottom layer of the class.
Wow.
And was there pushback or protest or reaction to that from the minority students?
The other faculty members and Ladoris ran around to reassure us that that was not the majority sentiment of faculty members, and that they would not have supported our admission if they thought that we could not succeed at Stanford comparable to everyone else. And for us, it made us so very conscious of how hard we needed to work while we were in the law school, and all the opportunities at the law school that we talked about. Who's going to do this so that there is diverse representation?
So this was
we didn't just leave it up to individual students of color to decide that they were going to apply to law, for law review or not. We talked about it to make sure that a number of people are applying. Same thing for moot court. Who's going to do moot court? Amongst ourselves, we made sure that there was diverse representation in all of those, major things going on in the law school all the time. Because, what do we know? maybe he had some information that hadn't been shared with us, that maybe he was right. So it was very disheartening, but so many people on the faculty did speak up, but never formally that I recall. I do not recall that anything was published.
And this was
taking exception.
1979? This was
Yeah, that was in
1979? Wow.
September 1979.
Yeah,
I don't recall anything being published.
I'm
Taking
pinpointing the
exception,
problem, because that is the year they let me transfer in too. So that may be what they were really concerned about. But so the numbers were.
That's it. It was all your
It was
fault.
just me. I've got
Tony,
So,
did you-
we have, as you probably now know, Alan, from that class, and not far behind us, we have one of several judges, Judge Richardson, but we have judges in that class. We have law professors of color from the class of 1982. We have people who went on to become bar leaders, like myself. I was president of the San Diego County Bar Association. We have other bar leaders like that. So that particular professor actually ended up adding to the fuel of our determination to be successful, both at law school and in the profession, because we didn't just take forming identifiable bottom layer of the class to mean we would get poor grades in law school. We heard it as, you don't belong in this profession.
Bill Gould and Barbara Babcock were kind of different. As I understand it, Barbara Babcock, her mission was to encourage female students and as lawyers. And on the other hand, is that Bill was supportive of all students, but really didn't have that same mission that Barbara did. Does that make sense? Yes, no? Okay.
I think Barbara was more, Professor Babcock was more upfront and vocal, if you will. She wasn't silent. Bill was more, he acted, but he wasn't profuse. He was more silent in terms of the kind of support, and silent is the word I'm looking for. You felt it. He was always very encouraging, and you could tell that he was always interested in helping you get to where you wanted to be. I don't remember going to him asking for things. For example, I'm going to LA. Do you know people there? He offered. It was always Bill, doing that. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah,
No.
Alan, I had a run-in with a professor, like Regina, names remain out of it for the moment. And I remember going to Bill and telling him, can you believe this happened? And he immediately pulled out a dictaphone and basically took my deposition to make sure he had an accurate accounting of the event. He basically said, I don't know what we're going to do with this, but I want to make sure we have it in the moment if we need to use this later on. And he didn't go up and let's blow up the building. He was preparing for whatever might be the appropriate steps. So
and one thing about Bill, and you've all said this, is that Bill's door was always open. And then when you were having a discussion with him, that's why I understand from universally, is that Bill always seemed he had all the time in the world to talk to students, and not discouraging and saying, I got to do something else, but the conversations would continue because Bill would want them to continue.
Absolutely true.
And all three of you have continued to have some kind of relationship with Bill, some more than others.
Well, definitely. One of the things that Bill honored me with, in addition to generally continuing to be a friend and professional mentor after I graduated from law school, was he was doing a project for a client to establish a neutral and effective investigation and dispute resolution process for situations during organizing campaigns that might otherwise result in unfair labor practice charges, to try to intervene before it got to the unfair labor practice charge stage. And he needed some lawyers on the ground. This was a nationwide project on the ground to help him with that. And he reached out to me to ask me if I might be able to participate in that project, as well as, you know, several other Stanford students were attorneys that also participated in that project. This was after 2000. So the kind of relationship that he maintained with so many students as they were alum, I think speaks a lot about him as a person.
I grew up in a neighborhood that was basically all African American and Latino. So that until I got to undergrad, that was my experience through, you know, school, junior high school, a little more diverse in high school. But really my first truly, you know, integrated atmosphere was when I was at UCLA. So Stanford was a new experience for me, because Stanford even then was still predominantly white. My class was 12 African Americans. And so finding out that Bill was there was huge for me. My recollection is a little cloudy, but I think that he participated in the orientation for first-year law students, not for Black students, but just generally. And I was so taken seeing him and hearing him. And as we talked about, very down-to-earth guy. I made it my business to meet him as soon as I could, because, you know, he was a beacon of I guess, accomplishment and opportunity, because they described what his credentials at this orientation, and I was overwhelmed just listening to all the things he had already done. Most of my teachers were white. So again, the main exposure that I got, or the first main exposure to professors of color, was at UCLA. There were a few of them there that I had the opportunity and the privilege to have classes with, but no, that was not true at my schools, my elementary or middle or high school.
And you were recruited to Stanford Law School at that time by Thelton or by Ladoris Cordell?
By Thelton.
And at that time, you did have, of course, before you came in, a sense that there was African-American representation at Stanford Law School, and Thelton did a great job of making that clear to you.
Yes.
And how significant to you was that in making a decision to come to Stanford Law School?
It was significant in the sense that the other law school I was really looking at seriously was Bolt. And they did not make any of the effort that Thelton did to talk to me, to talk about, you know, the presence of Professor Gould and the importance of increasing the diversity of Stanford Law Schools. So that was a big factor, huge factor, in fact, that influenced me to go to Stanford.
My experience was completely different from Gary's, and I mean the opposite end. I was born in Harlem. My family was living in the Bronx at the time. But when I was about 5 years old, my family moved about 100 miles north of New York City into the Hudson Valley, which could not have been less diverse. So when I was in school, high school in particular, I think my class had fewer than 5% African American, and maybe about 1% of that Asian American, and maybe 1% of that Hispanic American. So really it was predominantly white. And so when I went to college, I went to State University of New York, Binghamton, or Binghamton University today. That's when I encountered a more diverse, still significantly underrepresented African American, Hispanic American population. But based on what I was used to, huge, just huge. And in those days, some would call it misguided. I would call it the university was trying to find its way. They had what they call third world corridors, which they allowed Hispanic and Black boys, girls, males, females to live together. And so they had dorms that way. Anyhow, I could interact with folks, and it was an eye-opening experience. I mean, outside of my family and the few Black friends that I had in high school, I'd never seen anything like this before. So that by way of saying that, although, as I said, it was a larger number of people, the percentage was very small. And I only had 2 African-American professors, even at the State University in those days. And they were in African-American literature. I can tell you their names because, you know, I had so few. Lofton Mitchell, who was a writer and a playwright, and Sylvanus Kuke, who had been an official in the Igbo government and caught up in the Biafran Civil War and had to flee to save his life when his side lost. And he went through Cambridge or Oxford, I can't remember which one. And he ultimately ended up in the US. And so those are my 2. And then, so I get to law school and lo and behold, there's Bill. Oh my God. And it was inspiring. It was someone who you could look at and say, here's an example of success. And understand in those days, we're talking about for me in 1970s, you know, other than Thurgood Marshall and a few others who were very prominent, you did not have a lot of example of successful African-American lawyers. And for me, I was looking at one, and one who was very smart, one who was very knowledgeable, and as we've discussed before, very approachable, very engaging. So in a lot of ways, Bill represented what could be for me, and I dare say others like me in my class, who had not seen a lot of examples of success. We weren't the children of lawyers and having gone to the very best schools. I mean, all I had to do was look in the parking lot of the law school to see the successful backgrounds. I mean, I remember seeing one of the guys drive by in this Mercedes, and I said, he's not a professor. I said, wait a minute, he's in my class. And this other woman go by in a Jaguar, and I said, she's in my class too. What have I gotten myself into here? So, I mean, it was a completely different experience. But anyhow, Bill was a real representative model of success. And that's very important for people of color, I believe, then and now. I met folks when I got there. I met Felton, I went in, had a lot of conversations with him, but I didn't get letters from folks or recruitment letters or any sort of questions or invitations to come visit the the law school. Mind you, I was in New York, so that would have been a long trip. But still, that just didn't happen. I just got a letter of acceptance in the mail, which I cherish because I had a few others, but it was my first letter of acceptance, and I said, "Wow!" And from Stanford, who could want anything more? Case closed. There was nothing that led me to believe that there would be a Black professor at Stanford Law School. If you had asked me at the time, well, do you think there are Black professors at Stanford? I might have said, yeah, African American studies, African history, maybe one might be somewhere in the sciences or math, maybe. But yeah, no, I had no expectations in those days of finding diverse faculty because I had not experienced it.
And do you remember the first occasion that you found out there is a Black professor here at Stanford Law School?
Yeah, it was in the Balsa meetings, I think. And someone said, hey, and I think it was Stelton actually, who was there and said, by the way, Bill Gould is here. You should talk to him. You should take his class. I said, oh, really? So, that was sort of my introduction to Bill being there, because otherwise I didn't know.
So, Keith, you were 2 years behind Gary then at Stanford Law School. So, Gary, did you see yourself as kind of being a leader in diversifying the law school, or was it diversified pretty significantly? When I started Stanford Law School in 1967, there were no African Americans in my class. There were no Latinos. There were no Native Americans, and there were 6 women. So what was it like for you to come there? And so having 12 in the law school, 12 African Americans in law school just shows what Felton had been able to do in a short period of time.
It's interesting. I didn't think in those terms. I knew that it was new. There were a number of things that let me know that number 12 was a big deal. Some of the professors were not especially welcoming to us. Bill and Thelton were real, what's the word I want? They were real anchors for me in terms of, in terms of telling me, you can do this and you belong here and all of that. But yeah, it was not interesting, it was challenging in a way, because as I said, there were some Stanford professors were not particularly welcoming. One of my recollections, and one of the reasons why I am as a teacher, first year was hard for me. Like Keith, I had no background. I had no idea what was needed to succeed at law school. And I kind of struggled that first semester. And I specifically recall going to a couple of professors during their office hours and getting the distinct impression, how soon can this be over? My feeling ultimately was that from their perspective, I was wasting their time. It was another reason why Bill was so important, and Thelton, because those were the 2 places where I knew I could go and get assistance, guidance, support, and that it was not going to be an imposition.
And did you become Go ahead, Keith.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a
Please.
comment on what Gary said. Gary, the only thing I would say to that is my experience, just being blunt, is that I don't know that Stanford in those days had very good professors who could teach They were excellent at research. They were smarter than a whip, but almost every visiting professor that came in to me was superior than most of the Stanford law professors as teachers. They did not relate well to the class. There were a few who were very good at it. And I don't want to name names at all, so I'll leave it up to people to figure out from their various classes who their favorites or least favorite were. But yeah, I mean, I felt that a lot of them were awkward and that they did not know how to convey well what or inspire people. That's why one of the other reasons why, as I've mentioned before, Bill was a refreshing breath of air, because he could do that and he could teach well and he knew how to entertain. I mean, there's just certain things that teachers need to do, and most of them didn't care. It's like, I'm here to do research or perish, and oh yeah, I got to teach a class or two. Okay.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with Keith on that observation. There was not that much of an emphasis at the time on people's ability in the classroom. And so my experience, especially first year, was very similar. It was just that in addition to people not being all that great in the classroom, they also were not willing to spend any time that in my experience, during office hours, trying to help you understand what it was they were trying to convey. Now, maybe that was just a general, I don't know, but as a Black student there, I just felt like I wasn't very welcome in those offices.
Did you know that there was Bill Gould was on the faculty at Stanford before you came then?
I did, and I think I knew that because of Thelton. Excuse me. I was recruited by Thelton. I submitted my application just because I was interested in Stanford. It was a name, and I knew it was a great law school, and I really wanted to stay on the West Coast. I didn't have any desire to go east, so that was why I applied. But obviously, Thelton got a hold of my application, so I remember getting a call from Thelton telling me, I really needed to come up and visit. That the school had this commitment to diversifying the student body. I don't remember if he mentioned Professor Gould in that conversation, but he did talk about the school's commitment to doing better with the student body, and that was a big part of his job. But I did come up and visit, and as I said, as my recollection is, I probably learned about Gould being there during the visit, and then for whatever reason, Professor Gould was part of our orientation for the first year class. It wasn't aimed at the Black students, and when I saw him then, I knew I had to meet him as soon as possible. I can never forget the first time in this office because of the way this office looked. I was like, oh my God. But that being said, he was extremely gracious, as Keith said, very, very approachable and down to earth. As I recall, he said to me, I don't teach any first year classes, but anytime you want to come by and just chat about the law school experience, you're welcome to do so. And I took advantage of that, by which means I met his sons, and eventually I wound up going out and playing catch with a hardball with Professor Gould and his sons. And that was sometime during my first year. And I knew by that point I was going to take his labor law class second year. That was the first thing on my list.
Did you have a sense dealing with the other of these 12 students that the fact that Bill Gould was the professor there was significant in their lives?
Oh, no question. Yeah. There are, and Willie and a student by the name of Al Johnson, we were pretty close in law school. And I think the three of us all at different points reached out to Professor Gould as we were going through first year. And as you know, he was unfailingly welcoming and gracious and all the rest of it. The rest of my class, I don't know as well. I mean, we were reasonably close during law school, but those are the people I can think of. And yes, we all reached out to Professor Gould as a support.
And Keith, could you think back and think how your law school experience would have been different had Bill Gould not been there?
I think that you know, I mean, to the extent that, as I mentioned, Bill acted as inspiration, there would be probably less inspiration. I mean, I wasn't someone who went to Bill often. And I think, but that was just I didn't go to any law school professor, frankly, very often. I viewed that almost as if being called into the principal's office, you know, so I stayed out of those offices. But no, but I mean, my experience probably, I don't know that it would have been terribly different, other than the fact that would I have taken his a labor law class? I don't know, maybe not. So it may have made all the difference in the world.
And you're taking his labor law class was because you were interested in that subject and really was not because he was an African-American professor at Stanford Law School.
Intertwined. I mean, I wanted to take a class with Bill, and I was interested in exploring labor law. I really didn't know what it was about, but I knew about Bill. And I said, yeah, this, you know, so let's get two birds with one stone here. And never regretted it. Was really, really, really happy that I went down that road.
And in fact, your career was as a labor
Right.
law attorney, both first for the NLRB and then in private practice, and especially working with the studios, correct?
Correct.
And will you continue to be in contact with Bill as your career progressed? Was there much interaction you had with him?
Periodically. I mean, Bill and I, on occasion, would have interaction, not regularly, but periodically. And then he once did me the honor of inviting me to speak at his class, which I did, which I found to be a very rewarding experience. So, yeah, I mean, periodically. I can't say I was a pen pal, that's for certain, but certainly I was incredibly happy and proud when he was appointed as the chairperson of the NLRB. And then I had to, ironically, approve him being appointed to arbitration panels in the entertainment industry on behalf of my company, given approval, which I did, of course.
And Gary, we've already talked with you about how significant that Bill was in your career, that at both helping you get the job at the California Agriculture Labor Board originally, and then when you decided to leave the ACLU, and he first proposed to you the idea that you would teach, which hadn't occurred to you previously.
Right. I would not be a teacher today were it not for Bill. He really encouraged me. I had this interesting situation because I loved working at the ACLU. I really did. But when my second child was born, I wanted to have some time to spend, you know, while she was a newborn with her. And as a litigator at ACLU, that wasn't working. So they had a program where I could take a leave for a year. And so I knew I was going to do that, but I didn't know what I was going to do because ACLU wasn't going to pay me. They just would take me back. So I called Bill and said, you know, I'm in this position. You have any ideas for me? Because Bill was my mentor. I mean, I really stayed in touch with him throughout. And he says, well, have you ever thought about teaching? I said, no. And he says, well, maybe, you know, let me scout around. In fact, that's how it went. Let me scout around and see if there are any openings, because sometimes temporary positions open up where law schools have a gap. And he found that the place, which was Loyola Law School, that had a person who was leaving for a year, excuse me, who taught in areas where I had practice experience. So then the next thing was, well, okay, here's this thing. And I'm saying, well, but I've never taught. I don't know anything about that. And he says, oh, you can do that. I can just hear him. Oh, you can do that. You know, you've been practicing in that area. So based on really that, I went ahead and took the plunge, and then the rest is history. I fell in love with it once I started doing it. And fortunately, I was reasonably good at it.
So Gary, this is great. I am a huge jazz fan myself. And although I'm a little bit younger than Bill, is that my taste to run mainstream jazz is something that that I appreciate. So, and this is the one conversation that I'm going to have that I'm really totally unprepared for, because I don't know what you're going to say, but I'm sure it'll go well. So let me begin by saying, so when Bill and we figured out the various kinds of panels that we would put together in terms of putting together a panel about how Bill affected my career, for example, or Bill's impact as being a great teacher, is that one of the ones that he suggested was that jazz is so integral to his life and so important to him that he thought it would be good on this. And he settled on you as being the expert, Bill Gould and jazz. So take it from here.
Sure. So I guess the way I should start, I was already, by the time I got to law school, really a jazz fan. My love for jazz probably began midway through high school. So I was already, you know, familiar with a lot of the great artists of the day, made it a point, especially in undergrad, to get to performances and so forth. So when I got up to Stanford, as I've mentioned, Bill was one of the people I absolutely wanted to meet, and I made it a point of doing that during my first year. And I think there's two ways that my familiarity with his love of jazz occurred. One was going to his office, because whenever I went to his office, if he was not otherwise occupied, meaning something where he needed to have quiet, he had jazz playing. So in addition to the fact that he was such a wonderful support, I could always count on enjoying my visit with him, because I knew there would be some good jazz on, and our tastes run pretty similar. And then during it would have been my third year, I became his research assistant. And that's when it really became apparent to me how deeply jazz was part of his life, because when I would go to work with him in his office, there was always jazz on. As I began to visit with him and his family at home, there was always jazz on. And usually it was someone that I was familiar with, and we would wind up talking about that individual or group. And Bill had a real expertise, so that while I love jazz, being involved with him really increased in many ways my knowledge about jazz and some of the artists. The other thing is that as I began working with him, we would sometimes sit down, and instead of working, or maybe after working, we would listen to something that he had in his office. So it was very clear to me he was a serious, serious jazz fan. And so after I graduated, and especially once I started working at the Agricultural Labor Relations Board, well, Sacramento, I was headquartered in Sacramento, and Sacramento's culturally, it would in those days, it was basically a cultural backwater as far as jazz was concerned. So I would come down to the Bay Area when I wanted to go hear some jazz and go to one of the clubs. And so one of the things I started doing once I started doing that I would reach out to Bill, and if he was going to be in town, we would get together and go to one of the jazz clubs. Timing wise, I'm not sure I remember all the different places, but we would do that and have a wonderful time. And it was a great time to catch up with Bill. And as I said, one of the great things was our taste in jazz was very similar. Miles Davis, Freddie Hubbard, people along those lines were people that he enjoyed and I enjoyed, and we would spend time just talking about it. So anyway, eventually I wound up moving back home here in LA, and so when Bill would come down, because I'm going to get this maybe a little bit turned around, at least 2 of his sons live in LA, maybe 3, but certainly 2. So he would come down periodically. And when we would get together, when he would come down, we would do one of 2 things. It would either go to a baseball game or go to a jazz club, and we would hang out, and that was always a great time. And his son Bill also is a jazz fan, and so we would often be a threesome and go out to Catalina Bar and Grill. Before it closed down, we'd go to the Jazz Bakery and hang out there and just, again, have a good time, you know, waiting for the music and talking and catching up and then enjoying the music. So it is a real important part of Bill's life. I guess the last thing I'll share right now, just, you know, sort of talking about it, I wanted to find a way to really thank Bill for being such an important influence in my life, for pointing me to the academic career, which I have tremendously enjoyed. So my annual tradition now is I always find something in the way of a collector's edition of one of those artists to share with Bill as his Christmas holiday present. And invariably, I get either a phone call or an email, which literally and figuratively is basically a big smile and a big thank you, because he has now spent a couple of hours listening to whatever and enjoying it.
How do you think that his love for jazz ties in, if it does, with the other things that we know about him?
I think, well, one of the ways I can think about it is for him, one of the ways that I think he's one of the ways in which he stays connected with the Black, if you will, cultural life. You know, academia, and I can speak to this myself, it can be a very different environment, especially from what I would call Black community kind of concerns. And so, you know, being connected with jazz, going out to jazz events, it puts you back in contact with a very important stream, if you will, of influence in the Black community. And I think that that's one of the ways in which I think it influences Professor Gould. Also, I think it is another way, a reflection of what everyone that I've been involved in these conversations has talked about, which is his, just his openness and his humanity, so to speak. I think that that is the love for jazz is a reflection of that, because jazz is a music that is community in the sense that, number one, the musicians are communicating on the stand in a way that is unique to jazz. You know, to be able to improvise and do things and play with people on the spot is part of that tradition. And I think that Bill's his connection with his classes, his connection with his students, some of that comes from his love of jazz.